Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the strangest military conflicts in modern European history. A war started by a dog. But before we get to that, we need to understand the shaky ground Europe was standing on after the First World War. Because this wasn't just about a border incident, it was about a continent built on sand. After World War I, Europe didn't just suffer physical destruction. It suffered institutional and psychological trauma. Empires collapsed. Revolutions erupted. Millions of people were displaced. But instead of thoughtful reconstruction, many of the continent's wounds were hastily stitched up with the Treaty of Versailles and several other regional treaties like Neuilly, Trianon, and Saint-Germain. These treaties redrew the map of Europe, often in ways that ignored ethnic realities, local identities, and long-standing historical grievances. The result? Fragile, artificial borders that turned neighbors into rivals and left simmering tensions just waiting to boil. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Balkans, Europe's notorious powder keg. Greece and Bulgaria, for example, had fought against each other in the Balkan Wars before the Great War even began. Their antagonism didn't magically disappear in 1918. In fact, it deepened. Territorial disputes, lingering resentment, and a lack of genuine reconciliation meant that the region remained volatile. And there was no system in place to cool tempers before they ignited. Enter the League of Nations, the world's first attempt at a permanent international peacekeeping organization. Sounds promising, right? The League was supposed to prevent war through dialogue, arbitration, and collective security. But there was one major problem. It had no teeth, no military, no real enforcement power. So when tensions flared between nations, especially smaller ones like Greece and Bulgaria, the League could issue statements, but not stop bullets. So what do you get when you mix arbitrary borders, unresolved rivalries, and an international institution with no real authority? You get a world where even a stray dog can cause a war. Up next, we'll take a closer look at the structural weaknesses that made post-war Europe such a dangerous place, and why the very systems meant to prevent conflict may have actually made it more likely. So, what made post-World War I Europe so volatile, so sensitive, that even a minor border incident could spiral into full-on military conflict? Let's start with borders. After the war, many national boundaries were redrawn like puzzle pieces jammed together by someone who lost the box lid. The result? Ambiguous, poorly defined frontiers. Some villages didn't even know which country they were in anymore. You had regions with overlapping ethnic claims, ancient rivalries, and contested ownership, sometimes decided by politicians who had never stepped foot in the area. This confusion created a perfect environment for frequent, low-level confrontations. Soldiers, customs agents, and civilians constantly bumped into each other across vague or disputed lines. And because no one could agree on where one nation ended and another began, every little incident had the potential to be the start of something bigger. But blurry borders weren't the only problem. The command structures in these nations were deeply centralized, rigid, top-down hierarchies where decisions were made in capitals. But skirmishes happened on the ground. That meant local flare-ups didn't stay local for long. If one patrol fired a shot, it wouldn't be handled by a village council or border committee, it would trigger a full national military response. There was no space for calm de-escalation, no room for, wait, let's talk this out. Everything defaulted to national emergency. And then there's something even more dangerous than blurred maps or centralized chains of command: pride. Honor. In many countries, especially in the Balkans, national identity had been forged in war. Military victory was seen as proof of a nation's strength, its legitimacy, even its moral superiority. So when a border was challenged, or a soldier was killed, leaders didn't just see it as a political problem. They saw it as an attack on national dignity. And when honor gets militarized, responses tend to be, let's say, less than measured. Put all of this together, ambiguous borders, centralized decision-making, and pride-based nationalism, and you've got a system rigged for escalation. You don't need a grand conspiracy, you just need a single misstep, or a single stray dog. Coming up next, we'll walk through the bizarre and tragic chain of events that led Greece and Bulgaria, two nations already on edge, into a shooting war sparked by something most of us would call man's best friend. Now, you might think that wars are started by invasions, assassinations, or grand strategic maneuvers, but sometimes it starts with a dog. Here's what happened. In October of 1925, near the small border town of Petrich, a Greek soldier was patrolling along the tense Greek-Bulgarian frontier. This was no ordinary patrol. Tensions in the region were already high. Remember, the border was poorly defined, and trust between the two countries was non-existent. Suddenly, the soldier's dog took off, crossing into what the Bulgarians considered their side of the border. The Greek soldier gave chase, which seems innocent enough, until you remember the powder keg he was stepping into. Now imagine it. A soldier, weapon in hand, sprinting across a disputed border in a high-stress military zone. To the Bulgarian troops watching from their posts, it may have looked like a provocation, or worse, an infiltration. They opened fire, the Greek soldier was killed, and just like that, a man trying to retrieve his dog became the catalyst for international violence. Greece, outraged by the death of its soldier, demanded an apology. When Bulgaria didn't comply fast enough, or with the tone Greece expected, Athens escalated. Within days, the Greek military invaded the border town of Petrich. It wasn't a symbolic move, it was a real, boots-on-the-ground military occupation. The so-called War of the Stray Dog lasted just 10 days, from October 19th to 29th, 1925, but in that time, it caused casualties, diplomatic fallout, and nearly tipped the region into broader conflict. So, how does a soldier chasing a pet become a military invasion? The answer lies not in the dog, but in the systems and incentives surrounding the event. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. Alright, so we've got a dead soldier, a border town under Greek occupation, and two countries staring each other down. But here's the real question, why did this spiral so quickly? Why didn't cooler heads prevail? Because the systems in place, political, military, and diplomatic, weren't designed to de-escalate. In fact, they incentivized the opposite. Let's start with the consequences. In a more stable, decentralized system, this kind of border incident might have been handled quietly, maybe through local commanders or neutral observers. But in this case, there were no safety valves, no local mechanisms to manage the conflict. So one isolated incident instantly became a national emergency. There was no in-between, just a binary, peace or war. That's a pretty fragile system. Now, add in political pressure. Greek leaders weren't just trying to respond, they were trying to perform. In the aftermath of World War I, national governments were under intense scrutiny. Any sign of weakness could be seen as betrayal. So, rather than appear conciliatory or diplomatic, they doubled down on toughness. Public image trumped reason. Diplomacy? That was for later. Right now, they had to look strong. And then there's the military doctrine. By this point in European history, the dominant approach to conflict was rapid mobilization. It was all about speed. Get your troops in place before the enemy does. Hit hard. Hit fast. The result? Nations didn't pause to ask, should we escalate? They were trained to ask, how fast can we mobilize? So when you mix rigid structures with political posturing and aggressive doctrine, it's not hard to see why something as minor as a stray dog could ignite a regional crisis. This wasn't just about Bulgaria and Greece. It was a warning about the dangers of centralized systems that reward reaction over resolution. And the consequences? They didn't end at the border. Let's turn to the next slide and see what happened when international institutions tried to step in. So, what happened next? How did the international community respond to what, on the surface, looked like a petty border clash? Enter the League of Nations. This was their moment. The whole point of the League was to step in before wars spiraled out of control. And here they had a textbook case, a small conflict between two member states, limited in scope, but dangerous in principle. The League sprang into action, or, well, they tried to. After reviewing the events, the League concluded that Greece had overreacted. Their invasion of Petrich wasn't seen as proportional. The soldier's death may have been a tragedy, but sending troops across the border was a violation of international norms. And here's where things get interesting. The League demanded that Greece withdraw its forces and pay compensation to Bulgaria, £45,000 British pounds. To be exact. Now think about that. Bulgaria wasn't punished for shooting the Greek soldier. Greece was punished for responding too aggressively. From Greece's perspective, this was humiliating. They saw themselves as defending national honor and securing justice. But the League, trying to act like a referee, essentially blew the whistle on them and said, too far. Now, this raises a serious question. Did the League actually prevent further violence, or did it simply reinforce the power dynamics already in place? Remember, the League had no army, no real ability to enforce its rulings. Its authority depended entirely on public perception and voluntary compliance. It was less of a watchdog, and more of a stern schoolteacher with no ruler. So, yes, Greece did pay the fine. They did pull out of Petrich. But the deeper problems? Unresolved. Tensions remained. Respect for the League weakened. And most importantly, the war had exposed just how little power these international bodies had when push came to shove. The War of the Stray Dog may have been short, but its consequences echoed far beyond the Balkans. It raised a quiet but powerful question. What good are global institutions when national pride, rigid systems, and poor incentives keep dragging countries to the brink? That's what we'll tackle next, because history is full of small incidents that tell us much bigger truths. Now that the dust has settled, let's take a step back and ask the bigger question: what does the War of the Stray Dog really teach us? Because this wasn't just an absurd episode tucked away in some forgotten Balkan history book. It was a warning, a case study in how centralized systems, rigid doctrines, and national pride can combine to create chaos out of nothing. Let's start with the obvious: over-centralization. When power is concentrated at the top, whether in government, the military, or diplomacy, there's often no room for flexibility. Local commanders can't make judgment calls. Diplomats are sidelined. Everything funnels upward to bureaucrats or politicians who are too far removed to understand the nuances on the ground. That's how a dog crossing an invisible line becomes a military operation. Then there's the matter of pride, weaponized pride. In this case, both Greece and Bulgaria viewed backing down as a sign of weakness. Honor became more valuable than life. In a decentralized system, there might have been space for local negotiation or non-violent resolution. But in a centralized one, every decision becomes a performance on the national stage. And finally, the League of Nations. While its intentions were noble, it lacked the structural strength to intervene meaningfully. It operated more like a symbolic court than a stabilizing force. Sure, it got Greece to withdraw and pay reparations, but it didn't address the root causes. It didn't stop future conflicts. It simply put a bandage on a broken bone. So what patterns do we see? We see systems that reward reaction, not reflection. We see institutions that look powerful on paper, but falter in practice. And we see how fragile peace really is when decisions are made from the top down without understanding the local dynamics or respecting the limits of coercive power. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a product of design, systems that didn't allow for calm, contextual judgment, systems that punished restraint and rewarded escalation. And those kinds of systems tend to repeat themselves. Up next, we'll tie all of this together and reflect on what this strange little war tells us about the world we live in today. A man chases his dog across a blurry border. Shots are fired. Troops are mobilized. An international crisis unfolds. It sounds like the plot of a satirical novel, but it happened, and it tells us more about power, systems, and human behavior than most major wars do. The War of the Stray Dog is a reminder that history isn't just shaped by grand ideologies or towering figures. Sometimes, it's shaped by structure, by the incentives baked into institutions, by the rigidity of command chains, by the stubborn pride of nations trying to prove themselves on a shaky global stage. And it's a warning: when you build systems that rely entirely on centralized decision-making, with no space for local resolution, you build fragility. When pride becomes policy, and image becomes more important than wisdom, escalation becomes inevitable. And when international institutions lack the means, or the courage, to intervene meaningfully, they become observers rather than guardians. This strange little conflict reveals a deeper truth: peace doesn't just depend on avoiding big wars. It depends on designing systems that can handle small ones, systems that de-escalate, that adapt, that learn. So the next time someone says, "It was just a minor incident," remember Petrich, remember the dog, and remember what happens when minor incidents are left in the hands of major systems that don't know how to pause. If you enjoyed this video and want more stories that dig into the overlooked corners of history, where the absurd meets the profound, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. And if you want to take this episode on the go, check out the podcast version linked in the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious, stay questioning, and stay grounded in the truth behind history.